Arkansas born and bred, Larry Eikleberry was interested in fine art from an early age, but a chance meeting with Walt Disney in 1961 sent the teenage Larry in animation's direction. After a decade as the director of a large art gallery, Mr. Eikleberry made his way to California and a lengthy career in television animation, where he worked for all the major small-screen producers, from Filmation to Hanna-Barbera to Disney Television Animation. When I first got to L.A., says Larry, animation veteran Milt Gray told me that it took 7 years to do the circuit of all the cartoon studios, and I found out that that was pretty much true. Finishing his career with a 10-year stint at Disney Consumer Products, Larry has now returned to the world of fine art, where he is an accomplished portrait painter. We spoke in the conference room at the Animation Guild. And here we are on September 14th, speaking to animation artist, portraitist, designer, layout artist, background artist, storyboard artist, Larry Eikleberry. And Larry, to start off with, you were born and bred in Arkansas. How does a kid growing up in Arkansas find his way to the Los Angeles animation industry and fame and fortune and all that kind of good stuff? I mean, what were your first stirrings in art?
I think seeing Snow White at the age of 5.
Yeah.
And being kind of blown away by that, and then just taken by cartoons in general. The Out of the Inkwell, when I was in the 4th grade, I think you used to see those pretty often on television.
Oh yeah, they were sort of early television fodder.
Yeah.
They were on all the time.
Yeah.
Out of the Inkwell, Felix the Cat.
Sure.
All that stuff.
And when Disneyland came on, then I was very enthusiastic about that. And my folks, in fact, I harped on them to take me to Disneyland when I was 15 or 16.
That would have been 1960, 61.
Right.
And you came out to Disneyland in Anaheim, and what happened to you when you were at the park? Because you told me this story some time ago, and I've always been fascinated by it because it never happened to me.
Well, it was, I went to the information desk and asked the people there if I could get a pass through the studio, and they said, "We'd like a pass through the studio."
We'd like one.
So I thought, well, so much for that, and I asked if how often Disney came out to the park, and they said, "Oh, usually once a week. You'll sometimes see him out here. He drives a little yellow car, and it's a little vintage car, and so they said, but he's in Europe right now." And about that was early in the morning, and about 4 o'clock that afternoon, I saw Walt Disney with an architect who had some drawings under his arm.
And where was this? On Main Street?
This was on Main Street, and I used to practice my speech, what I was going to say to Walt Disney that would distinguish me from everybody who just asked for his autograph. And, of course, the speech went right out of my mind. And I went over and said, I asked him if I could have his autograph, and he said, "If anybody sees me take out a pen, I'm a dead duck." So I did not get an autograph.
But you were the only one that went up to him? Nobody knew?
No one else
noticed him
or really said anything about it. And I was going to meet my folks there at 4:30, and he was actually in a Suncrest orange shop when I saw him, and the band started playing, and he walked outside, and I saw my parents, and I said... And I went up and I stood by him, and I have a picture that my folks took with me standing there like we're buddies, And then some woman said, "There's Walt Disney," and people went, "Oh," and kind of started moving in on him, and he went right into the firehouse and disappeared. That was that.
He disappeared. I remember you telling me the story that people just sort of started mobbing him, and he was just, boom, it's like he was gone.
Yeah.
So
I hung around for a while thinking I might see him come out, but
He never reemerged.
He never reemerged. No.
So how long did you talk to him? About 4 minutes? 5 minutes?
I talked to him long enough to say that I would like to work for him someday, and that I would like a pass through the studio. And he said, "You call Ken Peterson and tell him that you talked to me, and he'll get you a pass through the studio." So I went through 5 or 6 Ken Petersons before I found the right one that evening.
Yeah.
It just so happened that was his anniversary. I talked to his daughter, and he thought that I was a friend of his from Louisiana that was putting him on.
Really?
And when he found out I really was this 15 or 16-year-old kid from Arkansas, he said, "Well, okay, I'll have a pass for you at the studio on Monday morning." And there it was, and I had a pass to the studio.
You got your parents to drive you up to the studio?
Got my parents to drive me up there, and I met Al Taliaferro, who did the Donald Duck comic strips, and that was a real treat.
Yeah.
I remember him doing a little rough of Donald Duck with a ballpoint pen.
Yeah.
And, I didn't know anything about roughs. I didn't know that there was such a thing. I thought that everybody just drew with that, finished Disney line. And
yeah.
So I remember thinking, gee, that's not very good. And then I drew him Donald Duck that I thought was pretty good. And of course it was not. And I remember that the cap had a real tall bill, and that was the only criticism. He said the cap actually goes a little bit closer to the head, but I still have his little drawing.
Really? So how did you happen to meet the comic strip guy? Did you go through the animation department?
He was there. I think he was. I think he needed some strokes, and he, could. I think he even worked at home, but he came over to the studio to meet buddies and things like that, and just to have lunch. And
so, how long did you get to hang out at the studio at the age of 15?
A number, probably 2 or 3 hours, and. They said you could go anywhere except onto the 3rd floor.
That's the executive floor.
That's the executive floor. And I remember making my way up there. I had a lot of audacity in those days. And
so you went up to the 3rd floor, right?
Quickly, yeah, I was quickly
escorted away.
Scurrying away, yeah. But it was a great experience.
So did you walk into any of the animation wings, the background department, layout department?
They had a fella there whose name was Bob Yenquist.
Yeah, I remember him.
And he had a little sequence from Pinocchio. And apparently, his job at that time was to show people how animation worked, because these drawings were worn out. They'd been flipped so many times.
He was the official greeter for outsiders.
He was the official greeter for outsiders, and I found out later that he also did Walt's signature on photographs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think he was the 3rd person to do them, and so when I wrote in the 4th grade to get a signature,
it was probably Bob.
It was Bob Yenquist, yeah. I could see the different versions of people's signatures, and mine was Bob's, so I would have thanked him at the time, but I didn't realize
you didn't know it was him.
Till years later, yeah.
Well, so you returned to Arkansas at the ripe age of 15, and was that where it was settled in your mind that I'm going to go out there and work?
I think so. I went to a little liberal arts college for 2 years, and had a great time, but the art department wasn't very good. And I worked for a man who graduated from the Kansas City Art Institute, and of course Disney went there. And so I thought, well, if it was good enough for J.R. Gray and Walt Disney, I guess it's good enough for me. And so after 2 years, I transferred there and studied painting. And graduated, I think, after about 3 years. I lost a year when I transferred. And then I actually went to work at Hallmark. Vietnam was going full bore, and I worked at Hallmark for about 6 months until I went on active duty, and then came back. And then worked as director of Nelson Gallery in Kansas City for 10 years.
I want to get into that, but the one thing I want to get back, you encountered Walt Disney yet again
Yes.
while you were at
the Art Institute. Yeah, the dean knew that I was interested in animation and told me on a Friday that Walt Disney was going to visit the school on that Sunday, and this would have been on October, an early part of October.
1966.
Of 66.
Yeah.
And he said, please don't say anything to anybody else about this because he's just going to be here for a couple of hours and he's going to be in and out and it's very low profile and he doesn't want a big to-do. But since I know that you're interested in that, I thought that I would let you know and you could be in the student center and at least see him, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, this time I won't forget my speech, my little speech. I'm ready for him this time.
You're 5 years further on.
I've waited, and so, you know, here he comes out of the administration building, making his way into the dorm, and I've planted myself next to the house mother.
Yeah.
And I'm also president of the student council, so I'm sure to get an introduction here. And this was 2 months before he died, which, of course, nobody had an inkling that he was sick. But his hair was white, which was shocking.
Yeah.
And I can remember, you know, putting my hand out and starting to do my little spiel, and he looked at me and very sort of clearly communicated somehow, please don't. And I just went, nice to meet you. And that was that.
And he said hello. And
he sort of said hello, and there was like a little acknowledgement, you know, thanks for not slobbering all over me. And he broke away from this little entourage and walked into one of the galleries and sort of stayed in there by himself for a little while, looked around and came back, and people were looking at each other like, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to go in there with him? And he was pretty detached from what was going on, you know. You could tell he had that kind of really sort of far away look. But that was you know, a little different experience than the first time. But I'm glad I got to do that.
Saw him that second time.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
So moving back after Hallmark and after your Army hitch, you became the head guy at the gallery.
I was director of education at the Nelson Gallery. We had a great creative arts program. We had a little film program for kids.
And that was in Arkansas?
Kansas City.
Kansas City. Oh, yeah, Kansas City.
Yeah. And then that job and a marriage sort of came to an end after 10 years, and I thought, aren't you supposed to go to California? That's what I was going to do anyway, go out and kind of make it in animation, you know. And so it seemed like a good time to make that move. To depart, and I came out here, and someone said you have to enroll in classes that Hanna-Barbera is having. Harry Love was teaching those. Remember Harry?
Yeah.
Love?
Oh, yeah.
And I think I only went maybe 3 or 4 times, and I had submitted a portfolio at several studios, and got hired at Filmation. So not having to do the animation, you know, they literally were holding up sheets of animation paper saying you put the round hole over the round peg and the two, you know, I'm thinking, whoa, this is really, people are going, really? So
you were past that part.
I was past that, not a lot past that, but I did know how to put the paper on the pegs. And so I went over to Filmation and cheerfully started working on, I think, Mighty Mouse or something like that.
Yeah. You were on Mighty Mouse, and you were on Fat Albert, and you were on all of the Filmation classics of the period.
Yeah.
And
I was on my way to getting in the union. You know, I think you have to work 6 months and then you become...
X number of, you have to work X number of days and months. I don't know what it was then.
Yeah.
Now it's 30 days and then you're sent a little welcoming packet with pay us money.
Yeah.
So that all happens. And I think it kind of happened the same way there. It might have been a slightly different time frame. But how long did you stay at Filmation?
I think I was there maybe 3 or 4 seasons. You know, I have to tell you, the very first day that I went to work at Filmation, Milt Gray was packing a box of his things and said to nobody in particular, "It takes about 7 years to make the rounds."
Of all the studios.
Of all the studios. I didn't know what he was talking about at the time, but it takes 7 years to make the rounds. And I think after about 3 seasons at Filmation, I thought, well, gee, you know, this is kind of nice. And I always liked the physical plant. You know, it seemed to have kind of about 130 people worked there. It was a nice size, and everything happened in-house, so you could actually go walk around the corner and see what your backgrounds, how they were being finished, and it was just a great learning place. And but I think after,
and you worked for Herb Hazelton.
Worked for Herb,
and he was a terrific artist in his own right.
He was. I think Herb hired me because we both liked early American painting. Herb was a terrific artist and a terrific boss, but you know, we both were Sargent fans, and so that was one of the things that we had in common. You know, I was always surprised, frankly, that there were as many good artists in animation who really weren't that interested in fine arts. I mean, a lot are, but you'd be surprised at how many are
really
not.
Aren't.
Yeah.
Well, you came from a fine arts background. You'd been a
That's true.
gallery curator, and you'd been in the institute and studied painting. So wasn't your orientation always fine art?
I guess it actually was, because they thought my interest in animation was suspect.
They thought you were slumming.
Yeah, slumming. You don't want to go out to California and be an animation bum.
Yeah, but that's where the money at the time was.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
So, okay, so you do 3 seasons at Filmation, and do you remember you told me, this was years ago over lunch, you told me that you said, you know, I don't think this place is necessarily going to be open for a lot longer, so I think I'll move on. And then you said you looked back several years later, working other places, and it was bigger than ever.
It was huge.
And you thought, I guess I was wrong.
Yeah, I don't know anything. I took a great deal of pride in knowing when the ship was going to sink, you know, and I thought, you know, if we were making anything but cartoons, this would surely be going down for the third and last time. But I left, you know, thinking I was real smart, and they became huge with the He-Man, and so before long I was back at Filmation and happy to be there. You know, I did make the rounds, and Milt Gray was right. It does take 7 years, and there's not that much difference, you know, from one studio to the other.
So in that 7-year round, where did you go during that 7 years? What studios did you visit and work at?
I worked at Ruby Spears on Chipmunks for a little while. I worked at a non-union shop called Animation Filmmakers.
And you said one of the co-owners was the former model of Tinkerbell?
Yeah, she was the model for the live-action model for Tinkerbell. And I can't remember her name, but she was...
And her husband had worked at Disneyland.
He was a television director who was the director in Tomorrowland.
For that big special opening.
Yeah, for the day that Disneyland opened. And they were doing... they somehow managed to get the license to do an animated version of Flipper, but I don't think it ever actually got finished or on the air.
So that was about a 6-month gig working for them, or were you there longer?
Probably a little bit longer than that. And I worked for Bill Melendez, too, for a little while. I'm not sure it was that break. But
somewhere in there you worked on the Charlie Brown stuff. And describe that studio, because that was a studio. For some reason I'm familiar with it, even though it was never an 839 studio, but a Teamster studio.
Yeah. It was on Larchmont, and it was 3 private homes that Bill Melendez bought, and his studio was all 3 houses. And the only way that you would know that anything was going on there is every once in a while you'd see somebody pushing a moviola between the 2
one house
houses
and
or
another.
something. Yeah, and you'd walk into Bill's front office, and I think there were 7 Emmys
Lined up on a mantle.
nicely lit, so there was lots of sparkle, and he was amazing. I don't think I've ever seen anybody who could change his demeanor quicker. He could be sitting at a drawing board 100% into what he was doing, and on a dime could light the room up with charm and interest, and
just by pivoting around.
And the lights suddenly came on, and then when he was through, they went off and back to the board he went.
And he would, because he did a lot of animating as well as directing on those specials and TV shows. So
how long were you down there working for Melendez? That was about a year?
About 8 months, yeah. And that was during the strike, so I felt like I was really lucky to be able to get that job, because it was sanctioned, since that was a union shop.
It was a Teamster studio.
Right. So it was really the only place that you could sort of really legitimately work during that time,
And so you were lucky enough to land there.
Yeah.
And you talked. What was Ruby Spears like? Because you were over there
within that same time frame of the early '80s and all of that.
That was very pleasant. I worked for Larry Huber, who I really thought was a terrific supervisor. He was the only person I think that I ever worked for who treated people differently. It was sort of like he had a sense of whether you responded to Mr. Nice Guy or whether he needed to be a little bit more direct, a little bit more confrontational, or he seemed to sort of just intuitively understand the best way to work with different people. And he spent a lot of time reading model train magazines, but when you came to him with a problem, he solved it. So, for my money, he was one of the best.
He's now solving the problem. He's the guy on Curious George. His own little company has just picked that show up, and he's going to be producing and I guess directing Curious George. It's sort of been resuscitated by PBS. So Larry's still out there pitching. He's still out there doing it.
He's a hustler. Yeah.
Oh yeah. He's
really competent and
really good at what he does.
Yeah.
And then
you were at Filmation just about at the end of the whole Filmation saga, because I remember you working downstairs when I was there, and I was there right at as it was breathing its last.
We moved to Woodland Hills, and I think we're there for maybe 2 years.
Were you there for the whole 2 years?
Yeah. And it was sold to L'Oreal, I believe.
Yeah, it was. And they immediately shuttered it.
Yeah.
And was that a shock, or was it like, well, I was just a few years off in my prediction?
It was a shock, but I remember people saying, I remember that the European market had just opened.
Yeah.
And so they were desperate for product. And what we were hearing was that the Europeans loved the stuff that was coming out of Filmation, and they didn't care if it cost more. They just loved it. And I thought that's kind of odd, because the stuff that's coming back from overseas is a little bit fuller.
Right.
And it costs a little bit less money. So it seems interesting to me that somebody would prefer something that costs more money and is limited.
Right.
Turns out they didn't really prefer that after all.
It was just a sales pitch.
It was just a sales pitch, as it turns out. And as soon as they had the
and as soon as the ink was dry on the contract,
that was a wrapperoonie.
It was over. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember all of us walking out with our cardboard boxes of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was. But you found your way shortly thereafter over to Disney Television Animation, didn't you?
Started doing storyboards for Winnie the Pooh. That was exciting, and it was really hard work. I think probably. I think at the time, I counted maybe 12 or 13 people who were working on that show.
Mm-hmm.
Who probably, those 13 people probably represented the best talent that I had worked with since I'd been in the business.
Wow.
All together at one place. Didn't last too long, but 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and that was in the days when they were down on Cahuenga, and they were in several funky little places.
They were on Cahuenga for a little while, and then we moved to the Academy building.
Right, I remember all that.
Yeah.
And you worked on a progression of series for them.
Yeah.
And what series do you remember finding most memorable or most enjoying working on? Was it the Winnie the Pooh stuff? Because that was actually pretty good stuff.
I think so. I think I did probably enjoy the Pooh stuff. I actually enjoyed working on that, and it was also nice to see a product that was sort of a little more polished than what we
been doing in Filmation and stuff like that.
Yeah. So they were actually putting some money into these things, and it was looking about as good as you could expect Saturday morning to look. Really.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I thought they were really well done,
yeah.
and at that period of time, you had been doing mainly layout and design before that. So, did you have was there any growing pains when you transitioned over to storyboards, or was it just another problem to solve? And
it was. Adjusting to having to draw so small really was a challenge, but I enjoyed storyboarding, and some directors over there told me that I thought this was one of the best compliments that I ever got. I worked for a producer who said, your stuff really looks good on the screen. And I could tell that a lot of artists were drawing for the page. It's almost impossible to resist that because what you have is a page in front of you. But I really honestly didn't think about the page. I thought about the screen. And so for someone to say, and he seemed to be a little puzzled. It's like, I don't know why. Your stuff looks good on the screen.
Is it that layout? You think it was that layout background, that painting background? Because you had been...
Actually, I think it's just. I think it has a lot more to do with how to present and withhold information. That's an interesting problem to solve for me, and
not overstuffing the frame.
Right. And one of the directors said to me one time, he said, "Your storyboards are very dense, and we hate you for it."
They hate you for it.
They hate me for it because, I would if a character's jumping over the fence, I would draw one frame of him halfway over the fence. I skip the one where he started and the one where he lands. An animator would show those two drawings
As the extremes.
as the extremes, and that's a good way to do it. But I would probably put one in there, which implies he's got to start, he's got to stop, so that leaves more work for somebody else. But it also leaves me another frame to say something else.
Yeah, yeah.
And I even would put the last word over one frame where I wanted the cut to be.
Yeah.
I don't know that anybody ever did it that way, but if they wanted to, it would work.
Yeah, yeah.
So I got some good advice from a writer friend of mine who was doing book reviews for the Chicago Tribune, and he needed the money, and he didn't have a lot of time to do them. And he said, I decided to only have these go through the typewriter once. It means I'm not going to rewrite. There's not going to be any spelling errors one time through. And I would be in the middle of doing a board and would realize if I switched these two shots, I could make a problem go away or whatever. But I created a problem for myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to sort of adapt the same attitude one time down, because there's not enough time for me to polish this the way Larry wants it and then do it again to polish it the way the director wants it. So I found that very helpful. It wasn't as satisfying because I wasn't turning in exactly what I wanted to see.
And you weren't turning it into what your standards would be
Right.
if you had an infinite amount of time.
Right. But that turned out to be good advice, because those are steps that have to be gone through.
Yeah.
It is going to be the way the director wants it, and it is going to be done in this period of time.
Yeah.
So those are the realities.
The science fiction writer Robert Heinlein once said, "Write it right the first time."
Yeah.
And it's draw it right the first time.
Yeah. And I think if you put some pressure on yourself to do that, you can get a lot closer to it than you might think.
Yeah. Yeah. So we were also talking, you worked for a short period in there for Hanna-Barbera, and you worked, and in fact it was a little earlier on, and you worked for Iwo Takamoto, and you were saying something about Iwo that I thought was really sort of interesting, that he was one of the few people that you encountered that
I thought that the work that he did over my roughs improved my work.
Yeah.
That it, in some cases it was so subtle you could hardly even tell what he had done, but if you flipped back and forth you could see. And he had a beautiful line quality.
Yeah.
And I had heard people sort of complain, everybody complains if somebody else sort of redoes your work. And I'm used to that. I'm in line, and there are people who redo my work, but I never had any problem with Iwo, because I thought that everything that he did was just an improvement. And he's the only person who I could say that about. I feel like anybody else who fixed me or improved me or corrected me
just
changed it to suit themselves, that's all. But with Iwo, better.
He moved it up to another notch.
Yeah.
And probably, I often thought that, working for as many years as he did with
Milt Call?
With Milt Call at Disney's, where, Milt probably wouldn't have put up with him as his right-hand man for as long as he did if he hadn't been, up to scratch.
Doing something right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, and he was, I've talked to old Disney animators who said that, he would go over, and assistants, and he would go over their work pretty meticulously when they were assisting and in-betweening for Milt. So I think it probably was something that he carried with him for a long time, because he had a hell of a long career.
Yeah, he sure did.
And all that stuff. So you stayed at Disney TV animation until the late 80s, didn't you, or the early 90s? You were actually No, it was probably well into the 90s. Weren't you still there
I was in the animation division, I think, for about 3 years, and then transferred to
character
consumer products.
Oh, consumer products.
Yeah, and that really was, it was a nice change of pace. I was lucky through my career that I spent, roughly 5 years doing storyboards altogether, 5 years doing character design, 5 years doing layout, and then probably another 5 years doing combinations of those things, even on the same projects.
Yeah.
But consumer products...
And this is Disney
consumer products had fewer fingers in the pie, paid a little bit better, and my work was sort of recognizable as it came out the other end of the sausage mill. So all of that, plus just not the grueling pressure of TV, was very appealing to me, and so I feel like I really thrived in that.
And what kind of work did you do in the products division?
Well, one project that I remember that I really enjoyed was I worked on the classics, the so-called classics, and on feature animation, so that. For instance, with Tarzan, I did the Viewmaster series for that.
Really?
There were 21 images. You had to tell the story in 21 images.
And
I worked with the people from Viewmaster, and they would show all these different effects. Like if one frame is white, like an explosion or something, and then the other frame is red, it causes an odd kind of optical thing that's impossible to get any other way. So they gave us a vocabulary, and that was great fun. And I was very pleased with the way that turned out.
Now, did somebody give you the story beats and here are the visuals, or did you have to work all that stuff out yourself?
They basically had somebody else sort of said, here are the story points. So it was, based on that, it was pretty clear what I needed to do.
But you had a heavy hand in conceiving you had a strong hand in conceiving the images and all that stuff.
Right. And sometimes, for instance, in Peter Pan, there are scenes that are complete in your head, but if you look for a single image that shows you everything, you will never find it. Like, for instance, where one of the kids lands on top of a hippopotamus and then opens the umbrella and goes under a little waterfall.
Stuff out of the movie.
You see a whole bunch of individual shots that lets your mind think, oh, they've walked over these rocks, under water, and then back up on this trail.
Continuity.
But if you wanted to show that whole thing just as an illustration of the whole group, you don't ever see that image in the film. So that's a lot of times those are things that we were concocting by pulling all these elements together and saying, here it is in one image, as opposed to the way we'd show it to you in a film, which is a burst of images.
Now, is it tough to pull that off, trying to boil down all those different individual images into
I think
into
that's
one?
I think that's fun to do because you're restricted to the film, so all of the information that you need is in the film. It's just a question of understanding what you need to see. And every once in a while you're lucky and the film shows you exactly what you want. You don't need another angle. You don't need anything in front. You don't need anything behind it. Like that sort of iconic image of Bambi with the flower on its tail. You do actually see that image, but it's just a split second.
It's fleeting.
It's just fleeting. It's a little more complex as if you actually look at the film.
So you have to sort of reimagine and re-image it when you're doing it.
Yeah, it's fun. It's actually fun to do.
And then didn't you do other stuff that you did with products besides the presentations for other media? Didn't you do posters and packaging, and what kind of stuff what was the whole panoply of stuff that they had you do that presented itself a challenge, because you ended up working with all of the animated characters, right?
Right. They had various groups. They had people who just worked on Pooh. There was people who just worked on Mickey. There were some people who just worked on classic Mickey, and then there were the people that worked on current features, and then there were people that worked on classics. I did both of those things. I kind of moved between those two areas.
Classic features and current features.
Right. And normally what we would do is before the film, well, it's interesting because the product needs to be available when the film is released. So that means that we're trying to get all that done, in some cases, before the film is done. And that can be hard, because...
If it comes out of the film, then what do you do?
That's exactly right. And that happens sometimes.
Do you remember a time where your boss came to you and said, "Oh, God, they've taken out, we spent weeks on this thing here, and they've taken it out, and now we're going to have to quickly come up with something else"?
I don't remember that specifically, but I do know that there were films that they decided to not put much merchandising into, and so we may have spent a month or so revving up for
doing stuff that they
doing
said,
stuff that, and then people, I don't know if it's, I don't know where that decision is made, but someone decides this is not, doesn't lend itself to merchandising, or I can't imagine them turning down any money, if they thought it was there. But a couple of times they've been wrong. I think the first Toy Story that came out, they didn't have much merchandise.
Really, they had no idea it was going to hit.
They had no idea it was going to be that big, And so they had a couple of things, but the second time they were ready.
They were ready because they knew. Did you work on Toy Story, the first one, at all, even though it was limited?
Not really, because they really didn't do much with it. I did do a little bit of work on Toy Story, but not much.
It's interesting because, the buzz around the studio, I would walk through there a lot. And this is when they had moved into the Hat Building. And the buzz around the studio was, this is really good. This is really going to be big. So that was kind of the rumor and the gossip at the Hat Building of this little out of nowhere studio in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and so there was some sort of knowledge in the air that this thing was going to hit, because I remember people coming up to me in the hall and saying, "This is going to go. This is really going to be big," and it's surprising to me that upper studio management didn't translate into more merchandise, because
they really, really missed a bet by not having more stuff ready to go. But I guess it was they just didn't have any high knowledge of that.
You know, I remember seeing some of the very early tests done with computer animation. I think one of the first things I saw was a dog running down a hall.
Yeah.
And then up steps. The camera was trucking behind it.
Yeah.
And its torso was a geometric form that didn't change its shape. And the legs and ears and all that stuff were drawn in a traditional manner. But the mass of the body was held in a computer.
Yeah.
And this dog ran down a hall, upstairs, and knocked over a lamp. And you could see the effect, the way the light changed.
Right.
But it was still pretty crude. And so I thought when they decided their first picture was going to be called Toy Story, I thought, that's brilliant. Because I didn't think they had perfected the squash and stretch to the extent that they had. I hadn't seen any evidence of that.
Right.
So I thought, you know, toys
are going to be stiff.
Are going to be a little stiff, and so you're going to forgive this lack of squash and stretch. And so that's brilliant because it's like Jay Ward was brilliant. You know, these characters, which are designed to not move much, are designed to not move much. If you draw it in a traditional way and don't move it much, it looks bad. But
right.
if it's contemporary and the movement's consistent with the design,
yeah,
no problem.
Well, and selling what the audience will expect, will accept.
Right.
I mean, that's, you know, it doesn't. If you're overselling something that they don't buy,
right,
then you're in trouble. But if you're selling something that they say, yeah, we get onto that, and I think the fact that it was toys and a story well told.
Right.
And the characters were appealing.
Right.
And the character and story arcs really worked. I think all those things taken together, it's like, oh, okay, I'm behind this.
Yeah.
You know, even though it's not something I've seen before. I've never seen computer animation. But I think, I think the fact that they went with what they knew, they took their limitations and did jujitsu with it and turned it into their strength.
Yeah.
So.
And really, by the time the picture came out, you know, a lot of the things that I was pessimistic about just sort of dissolved. You know, the squash and stretch had been taken care of, and you know there were going to be technical changes in the future. You know, like the drag and follow through with hair and stuff. They hadn't even thought about yet, but just gets more and more detail and.
Yeah. And so, okay, so you stayed at Products for a decade then,
right?
And
right.
that was really at the point where you hung up your animation and Disney hat.
That's right.
And called it a day.
Right.
Now, I'm going to ask you to wrap up what I always ask everybody, and we'll do a little with this. What would you consider to be, you told me one of them earlier, but what would you consider to be the 5 pieces of animation, either long form, feature, or shorts, or whatever, that caused you to say, that were inspirational, that made you want to get into the game, that made you say, this is a medium I want to be involved in, that inspired you?
Mm-hmm.
You talked about Snow White back when you were a kid, but what were some of the others?
I really every picture that an Disney animated feature that I saw after that sort of added to my desire to work in that medium.
Really?
But Snow White, I think, I was 5 or 6 years old when I saw that, and this is for somebody who doesn't have television or maybe even that might have even been the first movie that I saw. So,
Yeah.
the impact that picture had on me compared to the impact that any picture now would have on a 5-year-old, because they've seen thousands of hours of TV and movies and everything else, and so it's impossible for that to have the same effect.
Yeah.
But there was something about the color harmony and the clarity of the story, the simplicity of it, the fact that it was drawn and that
Wasn't flesh and blood.
wasn't flesh and blood, and it just it's just something that I turned on to, immediately. And as I was growing up, there were I became interested in sculpture for a little while. I thought, oh, maybe I'd like to be a sculptor, and I thought, oh, maybe I'd like to be a portrait painter, but it was always art related.
Yeah.
And it seemed like animation just had, it just seemed like more of a realistic opportunity than some of these other things, which I'm not even sure how you would go about. But
Getting into it and making a living at it.
yeah, making a living at it. I feel like I really feel lucky, that I was able to make a living drawing. I made a good living drawing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you have to have some chops at it. That always is helpful.
Yeah.
But then, when you talk about composition, because you come from a painting background, you would have been 14 when Sleeping Beauty came out. I don't even know if you saw it. But
I did, and I like the fairies in that. But it's not a real good picture, is it?
It has weaknesses. I just wondered in terms of the color and the design and all of that stuff.
Yeah, it has its moments for sure. It has its moments, but it's certainly not as entertaining to me as some of the early Disney films.
Yeah. What would be some of the others? We've named two. What would be 2 or 3 others, and then we'll call
I
this
think
a day.
Bambi. I think Bambi made a huge impact on me. Fantasia, of course.
Yeah.
Even Lady and the Tramp, I think, had. I think that going through the archives and looking at some of the original work, I think that the cleanup animation drawings on Lady and the Tramp are about as polished and as good as anything I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Especially for that style. When they moved into Dalmatians and it took on a more linear graphic style, that's enormously appealing too, and that's about as good as that style can get. But that Lady and the Tramp stuff really was appealing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they do the dog stuff and the 4-legged stuff well. Well, Mr. Eikleberry, I think we are at an end. We're
Great.
almost to the hour mark.
Great.
So
It was a pleasure.
I thank you very much.